In 2024, China's four economic pillars cracked together. Real estate collapsed. Local banks froze withdrawals. Prices began falling. And a record number of young graduates couldn't find work. This was not a slowdown. It was a synchronized breakdown. Property once made up nearly 30% of China's GDP. Now, over 400 million square meters of housing lie vacant. Developers ran out of cash. Millions of unfinished units left families paying mortgages on homes they can't live in. 70% of household wealth is tied to those assets. In Hunan, savers protested when they discovered their bank accounts were frozen. Meanwhile, over 300 small banks were forcibly merged or absorbed. The government stopped reporting key data. Youth unemployment? Last published when it hit 21%. When a government stops measuring the damage, it's not because the damage has stopped. It's because the truth now threatens the system itself. And when four crises strike at once, real estate, banking, deflation, unemployment, what collapses isn't just the economy. It's control. China's economic strength was built on four foundations: real estate, local finance, industrial pricing, and an upwardly mobile youth. In 2024, all four broke at once. The illusion of control didn't fade. It shattered. Let's begin with real estate. For 2 decades, property wasn't just a sector. It was the center of China's growth engine. Nearly 30% of GDP came from it through construction, materials, land sales, and investment. 70% of household wealth was tied to home values. Apartments weren't just homes. They were retirement plans, marriage prerequisites, and family pride. But the foundation was flawed. Developers sold homes before building them, then used the deposits to bid on more land, not finish construction. It worked until it didn't. By early 2024, debt ran dry. Evergrande collapsed under $300 billion in liabilities. Country Garden followed, defaulting on billions in bonds. Construction stopped. Buyers were left paying mortgages on holes in the ground. 400 million square meters of unsold or abandoned housing now sits empty. That's more than 6 Manhattans of unused space. Families protested. Mortgage boycotts spread to over 300 projects in 91 cities. And local governments, who rely on land sales for up to 40% of their revenue, watched their budgets evaporate. This triggered the second crisis: local banking. In China, small banks are heavily tied to real estate developers and municipal finance. When land values dropped and developers defaulted, these banks ran out of cash. In Hunan, thousands of savers found their accounts frozen. They weren't warned. They were ignored. Some were even attacked for protesting. In response, Beijing began quietly merging or taking over 300 rural banks in 2024 alone. It wasn't reform. It was triage. And while this unfolded, a third wave arrived: deflation. While the US and Europe fought inflation, China faced the opposite. Prices fell. Demand stalled. Factories slowed. Producer prices declined 16 straight months. Consumer price growth hovered near zero. In a healthy system, this might trigger stimulus. In China, it triggered silence, because stimulus requires confidence, and confidence requires data. Which brings us to the fourth crisis: youth unemployment. In 2024, 11.88 million graduates entered the workforce. The official youth jobless rate hit 21% before the government stopped publishing the number. Unofficial estimates are higher. Some say 1 in 3 are jobless or underemployed. One graduate reportedly applied to over 200 jobs. She got 3 interviews. No offers. This isn't cyclical. It's structural. Because the job market isn't just slow. It's shrinking under the weight of closed factories, bankrupt developers, and frozen credit. What ties these 4 failures together isn't coincidence. It's design. Each crisis is connected to the others. Property collapse weakens banks. Bank weakness reduces credit. Credit contraction drives deflation. Deflation kills jobs, especially for the young. And what makes this dangerous isn't the pace. It's the synchronization. All 4 pressure points collapsed in 1 year. And Beijing can't fix one without worsening another. Stimulate housing? You inflate the debt bubble. Bail out banks? You risk moral hazard and capital flight. Print money? You risk losing foreign confidence. Ignore youth unemployment? You lose a generation. China isn't facing 4 separate problems. It's facing one systemic correction that spans finance, trust, demographics, and ideology. And the illusion that this is temporary, that it's just a property cycle or adjustment period, has now been exposed. Because when your economic engine depends on hiding problems, You're not managing a slowdown. You're managing a collapse in slow motion. When a government stops publishing data, it isn't solving the crisis. It's admitting it can't. That's exactly what happened in China. In July 2023, the National Bureau of Statistics announced it would suspend youth unemployment reporting. No timeline, no method revision, just silence. Why? Because the number 21.3% was too loud, too visible, too dangerous. And that was just the start. Housing figures began to vanish. Data on mortgage boycotts? Missing. Empty housing inventory? Incomplete. Bank defaults? Undisclosed. Even producer price indexes, a key deflation marker, were quietly downplayed in state media. The numbers didn't stop existing. They just stopped being shared. On the streets, the signs were visible. Families protesting outside half-built apartments. Depositors lining up outside rural banks. University graduates deleting job apps and lying flat. But in official channels, nothing. No footage. No charts. No explanations. China didn't just bury the bad news. It disassembled the scoreboard. This isn't new for authoritarian regimes, but for an economy once praised for precision and long-term planning. This blackout is a red flag not just for citizens but for investors, because modern economies run on trust, and trust requires transparency. Foreign funds can't allocate capital into a system that withholds metrics. Manufacturers can't plan around black holes. Consumers won't spend in a market where the future is hidden. And Beijing knows this, which is why the censorship goes beyond media. It now targets math. Independent analysts are warned. WeChat posts on real estate risks are removed. Search terms like mortgage strike, youth unemployment, or bank protest are blocked. Even academic studies face review. Inside the system, officials are left guessing. Local governments operate on partial data. Policy decisions are shaped by what's politically safe, not economically sound. This is not risk management. It's information control. And control always has a price. The result is paralysis. No one trusts official forecasts. No one acts boldly. Everyone waits for someone else to move. And that's how deflation sets in, not just in prices but in decision-making. Silence becomes policy. Ambiguity becomes a survival tactic. And in that environment, even truth becomes toxic. Because truth shows weakness. Truth fuels doubt. Truth gives people the language to question power. So it's erased. One missing report at a time. One censored chart. One blocked keyword. Until the system no longer reports where it stands. Only where it wants to be seen. That's not governance. That's managed illusion. And once a system relies on illusion to function, its collapse isn't a matter of if. It's a matter of how long the lights can stay on. In most economies, a downturn triggers recalibration. In China, it triggers concealment. This difference isn't stylistic. It's strategic and dangerous. Because once a government stops using data to guide decisions, it starts using decisions to shape perception. And that's where China is now. The four crises: real estate, banking, deflation, and youth unemployment should have prompted urgent reforms. Instead, they triggered a pivot. Not toward recovery, toward narrative control. But this pivot created a new, deeper threat: external contagion. Here's how it works. For 2 decades, China was the world's dependable engine. Not efficient, not transparent, but dependable. Suppliers built around it. Investors poured into it. Multinationals planned on it. But dependence requires visibility. When data stops, trust stops. When trust stops, capital exits. And that's the twist Beijing didn't anticipate. The goal was to hide the internal fractures. But the result was a collapse in external credibility. Foreign direct investment dropped sharply in late 2024. Multinationals began cutting exposure. Apple accelerated its shift to India and Vietnam. Tesla postponed its expansion in Shanghai. Intel delayed capital plans. Not because of geopolitics, because of risk. Risk that can't be measured becomes unpriceable. And unpriceable assets become uninvestable. That's how China, once the epicenter of global growth, became a strategic liability. The shift didn't come with sanctions. It came with silence. A blackout of numbers. A vacuum of answers. A regime that treats questions like threats. This isn't just an economic misstep. It's a strategic inversion. China spent decades building its image as the disciplined superplanner. Today, it operates more like a state in retreat. A system covering tracks instead of charting futures. And the geopolitical cost is growing. ASEAN countries are stepping into supply chains once dominated by China. India is absorbing manufacturing reroutes. Mexico is gaining U.S. nearshoring capital. None of these shifts would be happening if Beijing had shown signals of course correction. Instead, it showed panic management, suppression, obfuscation, black box policy. Even domestic elites are feeling it. Capital outflows surged in Q3 2024. Luxury property in Singapore, Sydney, and Vancouver saw sharp upticks, driven by Chinese families moving assets quietly. They see what's happening. They're not waiting for confirmation, and that's the final twist. The system isn't just breaking from the bottom, it's leaking from the top. The more Beijing hides the rot, the more its own elite lose confidence in the foundation. And when trust leaves the room, so does money, so does talent, so does the future. China didn't need a trade war to fall behind. It just needed its own refusal to confront the truth. And now the rest of the world is adjusting, not to a rising China, but to a withdrawing China that can no longer be read, relied on, or reasoned with. When property collapsed, it didn't just affect developers. It set off a chain reaction that spread through every level of society. In 2024, construction sites across China went silent. Cranes froze mid-air. Concrete sat unmixed. Millions of buyers were left with contracts, mortgages, and no homes. Over 400 million square meters of unsold or abandoned apartments now blanket the country. Developers ran out of credit. Projects stopped mid-build. Workers went unpaid. And homeowners already servicing loans were left in limbo. For most Chinese families, property isn't an investment. It's the primary store of wealth. With 70% of household assets locked in real estate, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Confidence cracked. Families pulled back on spending. Big purchases stopped. Vacations canceled. Restaurants emptied. And as consumer demand fell, the next domino tipped. Small businesses dependent on local consumption started closing. Retailers downsized. Commerce slowed. This wasn't just fear. It was cash flow exhaustion. The job losses multiplied. Layoffs hit construction, retail, logistics, and tech. College graduates entered the market, only to find a hiring freeze. 11.88 million graduates joined the labor pool in 2024. A record high, but the economy wasn't ready for them. It was retreating. Youth unemployment hit 21% before the government stopped reporting it altogether. Some estimates place it far higher. For many young Chinese, the idea of upward mobility collapsed. College degrees no longer guarantee work. Career planning turned into gig scrambling. And with rising costs and falling opportunities, marriage and birth rates plummeted. This is how the demographic crisis begins. Not with aging, but with disillusionment. Meanwhile, local governments, already stressed from falling land sales, saw revenue dry up. 40% of municipal budgets once came from real estate transactions. That stream is now gone. Public services began to strain. School repairs delayed. Transit maintenance postponed. Civil servants reported salary cuts and benefit freezes. The middle class, once the engine of internal circulation, began to question the model entirely. Because if buying a home traps you in debt, if a degree no longer leads to a job, if government data disappears when things go wrong, what are people supposed to believe in? The economic engine didn't just slow. It fractured along the lines of trust. And the damage isn't cyclical. It's behavioral. When enough people stop spending, hiring, building, marrying, an economy doesn't just shrink. It stalls. Then it forgets how to grow. This is what a silent crash looks like. No fire. No headlines, just empty apartments, jobless graduates, and cities too quiet at noon. Collapse doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it spreads from within quietly, institution by institution. In 2024, China's financial system stopped behaving like a system. Banks stopped issuing credit. Investors stopped trusting reports. And the state stopped telling the truth. The real trigger wasn't just bad loans. It was the disappearance of signals. In Hunan province, thousands of bank customers logged in to check balances and found accounts frozen. No warning, no explanation, just technical issues. Those who protested were silenced. Many were arrested. Over 300 small banks were forcibly merged or taken over. None of them failed publicly. They were erased quietly. But savers got the message. Withdraw your cash now. A slow-motion bank run began. Local branches saw queues form before opening. Trust, once broken, doesn't regenerate. It migrates into cash, gold, or out of the country. Capital flight accelerated. Families sent funds abroad. Wealthier households bought homes in Singapore, London, or Vancouver, not for prestige but for safety. This is how a crisis becomes systemic. Not through financial contagion, but through behavioral shift. When middle-class Chinese lose faith in the safety of banks, they don't protest, they adapt. They stop investing, stop spending, stop declaring what they earn. And that breaks the foundation of any consumer-driven economy. Meanwhile, the ripple spread abroad. Foreign firms paused expansion plans. Manufacturers rerouted orders. Supply chains quietly shifted out of southern China. Not because of policy, because of opacity. Without reliable data, there is no risk pricing, no forecast, no trust. And when global capital leaves, it doesn't just take money, it takes momentum. That momentum is now flowing toward India, Vietnam, Mexico, countries that offer what China no longer can: visibility, reform, and long-term planning. And that shift won't reverse quickly, because it's not based on tariffs or ideology. It's based on system integrity. Beijing tried to suppress volatility, but in doing so, it triggered a much more dangerous force: structural doubt. Doubt in financial stability, doubt in long-term planning, doubt in the idea that crisis can be measured, let alone managed. The result is not revolution, it's stagnation. An economy where people hoard instead of spend, where firms hedge instead of hire, where silence replaces policy. And once that pattern sets in, even recovery feels risky, because no one knows if the numbers will return, or if they were ever real to begin with. A system doesn't collapse when the numbers look bad. It collapses when the numbers go missing. China's 4 concurrent crises: real estate, banking, deflation, youth unemployment, aren't isolated. They're interlinked fractures of a single model that can no longer bear its own weight. And instead of confronting that reality, Beijing chose to unpublish it. No housing data, no youth job reports, no bank transparency, no accountability. But silence is not resilience. It's erosion, slow, strategic, and irreversible. A nation that fears its own statistics can't lead a global economy. A government that hides its pain can't expect long-term capital. And a middle class trained to obey, now trained to fear, won't drive growth. So here's the real question. If China won't count the damage, how much deeper is it than anyone knows? Because a country that turns off the lights doesn't stop the collapse. It just makes sure no one sees where it hits first.